Montana Territory, 1875. The sky spilled pink and gold across the rugged Bitterroot Mountains as Garrett Nielsen reined in his horse at the edge of the treeline. A thin trail of smoke rising from a distant clearing caught his eye, unusual in this untamed stretch of wilderness. Most travelers stuck to established routes, not this remote basin where wolves outnumbered men 10 to 1. He adjusted his Stetson, squinting against the setting sun. At 25, Garrett had already learned one truth about the frontier: anything unexpected usually meant trouble. "What do you think, Bishop?" he asked his dun quarter horse, absently patting the animal's muscular neck. Someone who don't know better or someone who don't want to be found. Either way, it wasn't his concern. Garrett had survived 4 years as a cowhand by minding his own business and keeping to himself. The frontier was merciless to those who stuck their necks out. He'd seen good men die trying to be heroes. His father's words echoed in his mind. Out west, a man's only responsibility is to himself. Anything more is just asking for a shallow grave. Yet something about that distant smoke nagged at him. He'd planned to make camp by the river, but instead found himself guiding Bishop down the slope toward the clearing. Just a quick look to settle his curiosity, nothing more. He wouldn't get involved. The wilderness was no place for entanglements. As he approached, Garrett spotted what remained of a small wagon, its canvas cover torn and one wheel splintered beyond repair. No sign of horses, stolen most likely. He dismounted cautiously, hand resting on his Colt revolver. The campfire was still burning, which meant whoever had been here couldn't be far. "Hello, the camp," he called, not wanting to startle anyone. No response came. When he stepped into the clearing, the sight before him made his breath catch. A young woman lay collapsed beside the fire, her face flushed with fever, golden blonde hair spilling from beneath a once fine bonnet. Her blue calico dress was torn at the hem, caked with mud and what looked distressingly like dried blood. Garrett knelt beside her, touching her forehead. She burned like a branding iron. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, revealing fever-bright blue eyes that struggled to focus on his face. "Papa," she whispered before falling unconscious again. Looking around, Garrett saw no sign of anyone else. No father, no traveling companions, just a half-empty medical kit and scattered supplies. The wagon had been picked clean by thieves or scavengers. Whatever had happened here, this woman had been left to die alone in the wilderness. "Damn it all," he muttered, knowing he couldn't leave her. Whatever his father's wisdom about survival in the West, even he couldn't ride away from this, not and live with himself after. The woman stirred again, eyes opening momentarily. "They took everything," she managed before another wave of delirium overtook her. "Not everything," Garrett said softly, though she couldn't hear him. "You're still alive, and that's something." As dusk deepened into night, he made a difficult decision. The nearest doctor was in Whitewater Springs, a good 2 days' ride. She wouldn't last that long without care. His own cabin lay less than a day's journey northeast, a solitary place he'd built with his own hands after leaving the Triple R Ranch. It wasn't much, but it had a roof and walls, and he kept basic medical supplies. "Looks like you're coming home with me, miss," he said, carefully gathering her limp form in his arms. She weighed hardly more than a child, burning hot against his chest, as he lifted her onto Bishop's back before mounting behind her. As he guided his horse into the gathering darkness, Garrett Nielsen made a silent promise to this stranger in his arms, though he didn't quite understand why. She wouldn't die alone in the wilderness, not on his watch. What he couldn't know was how thoroughly this golden-haired woman would upend every truth he thought he knew about surviving the frontier. Hannah Pierce had been dreaming of water, cool, clean water washing over her parched throat, when consciousness finally returned. The first sensation was softness beneath her, so different from the hard ground where she'd collapsed. Then came awareness of a rough wool blanket covering her, and finally, the crackling sound of a fire nearby. Her eyes opened to an unfamiliar ceiling of hand-hewn logs. Turning her head slightly sent a wave of dizziness through her, but she could make out a small cabin room with a stone fireplace, simple furnishings, and a window showing darkness outside. A man sat in a chair beside the bed, his head drooping in sleep, a book open on his lap. She tried to speak, but her throat produced only a dry croak. The sound was enough to wake him. He straightened immediately, revealing a face that might have belonged to one of the frontier heroes in the dime novels her younger sister loved, handsome in a rugged way, with clear green eyes, light brown hair, and several days of stubble on his strong jaw. He couldn't have been much older than her own 20 years. "You're awake," he said, relief evident in his voice. He quickly poured water from a pitcher and helped her sit up enough to drink. Hannah drank gratefully before finding her voice. "Where am I? Who are you?" "Name's Garrett Nielsen. This is my cabin, about 30 miles northeast of where I found you." His voice was gentle but direct. "You've been fighting a fever for 2 days now. Had me worried you might not pull through." 2 days. The realization hit Hannah hard, and with it came the flood of memories. The attack on their wagon, her father's desperate attempt to defend them, the terrible gunshots, her flight into the woods, and days of wandering before finding the wagon again, only to collapse from the wound in her side that had festered. "My father," she whispered, though she already knew the answer from the compassion in the stranger's eyes. "I'm sorry, miss, I went back to look, found signs of a burial not far from where you were, looked to be a few days old. I said some words over it, best as I could." Tears welled in Hannah's eyes, though she'd known her father was gone even as she'd fled. The outlaws had made certain of that before turning their attention to her. She'd only escaped by pure luck. A startled horse had created enough chaos for her to slip into the trees. "Thank you," she managed, "for that and for saving me." Garrett shifted uncomfortably. Anyone would have done the same. But they both knew that wasn't true, not in this territory where life was held cheap and most folks had troubles enough of their own. "I'm Hannah Pierce," she offered. "My father and I were traveling to Virginia City. He had a position waiting as a schoolteacher." "That's still a good 4 days' journey from here," Garrett said. "Rough country, too." Hannah closed her eyes, exhaustion washing over her again. "I don't know what to do now," she admitted, hating the vulnerability in her voice but too weak to disguise it. "You don't need to figure that out today," Garrett said firmly. "First, you need to heal. That wound in your side was badly infected. I cleaned it best I could, but you'll need time before you can travel again." "I couldn't impose." "It's not an imposition," he cut in, though his expression suggested he was surprising himself with the offer. "I've got the space and you've got nowhere else to go, at least until you're strong enough to decide what's next." Hannah studied him, trying to understand why this stranger would extend such kindness. In Philadelphia, where she'd lived all her life until her father's decision to seek opportunity in the West, men didn't simply offer shelter to unmarried women without expectations. But there was something straightforward in Garrett Nielsen's gaze that suggested no hidden motives, just human decency that seemed somehow out of place in this harsh territory. "Thank you," she said finally. "I won't stay longer than necessary." Something that might have been disappointment flickered across his features, but he nodded. "Rest now, there's stew when you're ready for it." As he moved to leave, Hannah caught his sleeve with surprising strength. "Mr. Nielsen, the men who attacked us, they might still be looking for me." His expression hardened. "Did you see their faces?" "Yes, 3 of them. They seemed to know my father, though he didn't recognize them. They kept asking about something called Blackwater shares, said he'd cheated them." Garrett's jaw tightened. "The Blackwater mine went bust 2 years back. A lot of folks lost everything. Some turned outlaw after." He paused. "Don't worry about them finding you here. Nobody comes to this valley except the occasional Salish hunting party, and they keep to themselves." As he turned to stir the stew hanging over the fire, Hannah noticed how his movements betrayed a military precision, his posture straight despite evident weariness. This was a man accustomed to being alone, who kept his cabin neat not for visitors but for himself. The realization made her wonder what had driven him to this solitary existence, and why he'd broken it to rescue her. Little did she know that Garrett Nielsen was wondering the exact same thing. 2 weeks passed in a strange, peaceful rhythm that surprised them both. Hannah's strength returned gradually, the infection in her side healing cleanly thanks to Garrett's careful tending. Though he'd never said as much, she suspected he'd learned his medical skills during the war. He was the right age to have served, though too young to have fought for long. Garrett found himself constantly wrong-footed by Hannah's presence. He'd expected to feel intruded upon, to count the days until she was well enough to leave. Instead, he discovered an unexpected comfort in having another soul in his cabin. She respected his silence when he needed it, yet filled the emptiness with conversation when the isolation grew too heavy. She told him about her life in Philadelphia, about her father's position as a professor who'd lost his university appointment due to political disagreements, about her younger sister who had married just before they left for the West. In turn, he'd shared more than he'd intended about his years writing for the Triple R, about learning to track from a Crow scout named Two Hawks, about building this cabin after deciding he'd had enough of taking orders from men who valued cattle more than cowboys. What he hadn't told her was why he'd really left civilization behind, about the memories of Antietam that still woke him sweating in the night, about the 17 men he'd killed before turning 18, about how something vital inside him had broken during those blood-soaked days. On this particular morning, Garrett returned from checking his traplines to find Hannah outside the cabin, hanging laundry despite the chill in the autumn air. She wore one of his flannel shirts belted over her calico dress, her golden hair braided down her back. The sight of his clothes on her slender frame did something peculiar to his chest. "You shouldn't be exerting yourself," he said, dismounting and carrying his satchel of small game toward the cabin. Hannah raised an eyebrow. "I've been idle for 2 weeks, Mr. Nielsen. Any longer and I'll forget how to use my own hands." She pinned up the last piece, one of his shirts, with practiced efficiency. "Besides, it's the least I can do to repay your hospitality." "Garrett," he corrected, not for the first time. "Mr. Nielsen was my father." "Garrett," she acknowledged with a small smile, "and you must call me Hannah. Miss Pierce makes me feel like I'm back in my father's classroom, about to be scolded for daydreaming." He found himself returning her smile despite himself. "Did you daydream often?" "Constantly." "About places like this, actually." She gestured toward the mountains rising majestically around them. "Philadelphia has its charms, but I always longed for open spaces. My father thought I was merely being romantic. And now that you've seen the reality." Her expression sobered. "The reality has been both harsher and more beautiful than I imagined." She looked directly at him then. "Much like its people." The moment stretched between them, weighted with something neither was prepared to name. Garrett broke it first, clearing his throat and gesturing with the rabbits he'd caught. "I'll clean these for supper." "I can help," she offered. "I'm not squeamish." He hesitated. Most city women he'd encountered would faint at the prospect of skinning game, but Hannah had already proven herself different in countless ways. "All right," he agreed, "but then you rest. Your side still needs healing." They worked companionably at the outdoor table he'd built, her nimble fingers quickly learning the technique. As she worked, she glanced at him curiously. "May I ask you something, Garrett?" "Depends on the question," he replied cautiously. "Why do you live alone out here? You're clearly educated, capable. You could have a good position on any ranch or in town." His hand stilled momentarily. "The war," he said simply, knowing she'd understand. Everyone knew someone who'd come back changed from that terrible conflict. Hannah nodded, not pressing further, and he found himself surprisingly disappointed. Most people either avoided the subject entirely or demanded details of battles they'd read about in newspapers. Her quiet acceptance felt like permission to say more. "I was 16 when I enlisted," lied about my age. "Fought for the Union at Antietam, Fredericksburg, Gettysburg." The names fell from his lips like stones, heavy with memory. "Came back different, couldn't stand being around people much after. Their problems seemed trivial." "And yet you stopped to help me," she observed softly. Garrett met her gaze. "That wasn't trivial." "No," she agreed, "but it contradicts what you just said about avoiding people and their problems." He had no answer for that because she was right. Every instinct honed by 4 years of solitude had told him to ride past that smoke signal, to mind his own business. Yet something stronger had compelled him to investigate. "Maybe I'm not as committed to solitude as I thought," he finally said, surprising himself with the admission. Hannah's eyes warmed. "Perhaps that's a good thing." "Perhaps," he echoed, feeling suddenly as though he stood at the edge of a precipice. "Or perhaps I'm just a fool who's forgotten how dangerous entanglements can be." "Is that what I am to you, an entanglement?" There was no hurt in her voice, only genuine curiosity. Garrett considered her question seriously. "I don't rightly know what you are, Hannah Pierce, except that you're the first person in years whose company I haven't minded." Her laugh was unexpected and bright. "What a gallant compliment. I shall treasure it always." Despite himself, Garrett smiled. I'm not known for pretty words. No, she agreed, eyes twinkling, but honest ones have their own charm. As they finished preparing the rabbits, Garrett found himself studying her profile, the determined set of her jaw, the gentle curve of her cheek, the way sunlight caught in her hair. For the first time in years, he felt something stir within him that he'd believed long dead, a dangerous, hopeful feeling he had no business entertaining. Hannah Pierce needed his help, not his confused emotions. Once she was fully healed, she'd continue to Virginia City as planned, or perhaps return east to her sister. Either way, their paths would diverge. Better not to forget that truth, no matter how pleasant these temporary domestic moments might be. But as they carried their work inside, shoulders occasionally brushing, Garrett couldn't help wondering if it was already too late for such sensible thoughts. The first snow fell earlier than expected, blanketing the valley in white overnight. Hannah woke to find Garrett already gone from the cabin, his bed, a pallet near the fireplace, neatly rolled and stored. The fire had been built up recently, and coffee sat warming on the stove. She dressed quickly in the clothes they'd managed to salvage and modify from her trunk. The outlaws had taken valuables but left behind much of her clothing, which Garrett had retrieved on a return trip to the wagon site. The blue woolen dress was plain but warm, and she'd taken to wearing one of his old flannel shirts beneath it for additional warmth. Outside, she found him at the small barn, where Bishop and a mule named Hector were housed. He was chopping firewood with methodical precision, each swing of the axe powerful and controlled. Hannah paused at the cabin door, taking in the sight of him working in the crisp morning air, snowflakes settling on his broad shoulders. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine this was truly her home, that she belonged here with this quiet, honorable man who wore his scars, both visible and invisible, with dignified resignation. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Morning, Garrett called, spotting her. Snow's coming down heavier than I expected. Might be the start of winter proper. Hannah stepped carefully through the fresh powder. Is that a problem? He drove the axe into a stump and straightened. Could be. The pass to Virginia City will close soon if this keeps up. Once that happens, there's no getting through until spring thaw. The implication hung between them. If she intended to leave, it would need to be soon. I see, she said quietly. Then I suppose I should make arrangements to depart within the next few days. Something flickered across his face, disappointment perhaps, though he quickly mastered it. Might be wise. I know a man in Whitewater Springs who leads supply trains. He could see you safely to Virginia City for a fair price. Hannah nodded, feeling a strange hollowness expand within her chest. Of course she had to leave. She'd never intended to impose on Garrett's solitude indefinitely, yet in the weeks of her recovery, something had shifted between them, a comfortable companionship that felt increasingly precious. Unless, Garrett began, then stopped himself. Unless, she prompted, heart suddenly beating faster. He picked up another log, setting it on the chopping block. Nothing, just thinking out loud. You've got plans in Virginia City. Makes sense you want to get there. I have no plans there anymore, she reminded him gently. The position was my father's, not mine. Garrett brought the axe down with particular force, splitting the log cleanly. What about going back east to your sister? Hannah considered this. Her sister Catherine had married a banker and lived comfortably in Philadelphia. She would welcome Hannah with open arms. Yet the thought of returning to the confined, proper world of Eastern society now felt stifling after tasting the freedom of the frontier. I'm not sure I belong there anymore, she admitted. These weeks here have changed something in me. I keep thinking about my father's dream, not just teaching, but building something new in this territory. He believed education would be vital as Montana transitions toward statehood. Garrett studied her thoughtfully, seeming to choose his words with care. Teachers are needed everywhere out here, not just Virginia City. Even in Whitewater Springs, she asked, especially there, towns growing, lots of families with children running wild. He hesitated. You could winter there. See if teaching suits you before deciding on Virginia City. Hannah felt a smile spread across her face. That sounds like a sensible plan. Relief visibly washed over him, though he tried to conceal it by returning to his work. I'll ride into town tomorrow then, speak to some folks about arranging lodging for you. Maybe see if the mercantile owner has a spare room to rent. Thank you, she said, then more hesitantly, will you come visit the town sometimes? During the winter. His axe paused mid-swing. I generally avoid town when possible. I understand, she said quickly, trying to hide her disappointment. I just thought. But I reckon I could make an exception, he continued, not meeting her eyes. Need supplies occasionally anyway. Hannah beamed. I'd like that very much. As they finished the morning chores together, a comfortable silence settled between them. Hannah found herself memorizing small details, the way Garrett's hands moved as he worked, how the corner of his mouth quirked when he was pleased but trying not to show it, the gentleness with which he treated his animals. Later that evening, as they sat before the fire with cups of coffee, Hannah gathered her courage to ask the question that had been on her mind since their conversation. Garrett, why did you stop yourself earlier? You were about to suggest something. He stared into the flames, one hand absently tracing the rim of his cup. It was a foolish thought. I'd still like to hear it, she pressed gently. After a long moment, he set his coffee aside and met her gaze directly. I was going to suggest you might consider wintering here. But that would be improper, and I've no right to ask it of you. Hannah's breath caught. Here with you. As I said, a foolish notion. His jaw tightened. Your reputation would be compromised. And you deserve better than a broken-down ex-soldier living in the wilderness. Shouldn't I be the judge of what I deserve? She asked quietly. Garrett looked startled. Hannah. In the 3 weeks I've known you, Garrett Nielsen, you've shown me more kindness and respect than most men I've known my entire life, she interrupted. You've never once made me feel unwelcome or burdensome, despite the fact that I arrived unconscious and bleeding on your doorstep. That's basic human decency, not anything special, he protested. Is it? She shook her head. My father and I passed through settlements where people wouldn't share water with strangers, let alone take in someone injured and unknown. Garrett shifted uncomfortably. That still doesn't make it proper for an unmarried woman to winter alone with a man. No, she acknowledged. It doesn't. Relief and disappointment warred visibly on his face. So you understand why. Unless, Hannah interrupted, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he must hear it, there was some understanding between us. A formal understanding. His expression froze, eyes widening slightly as her meaning registered. Hannah, you can't possibly. I'm not proposing marriage, she clarified quickly, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. That would be presumptuous after such short acquaintance. I'm merely suggesting a courtship, an understanding that we might be exploring the possibility of a future together. For a long moment, Garrett simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then he stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the snowfall with his back to her. You don't know me, he said finally, his voice rough. Not really. I know enough, she countered. I know you're honorable, kind, and brave. I know you prefer solitude but aren't incapable of companionship. I know you wake sometimes from nightmares of the war, but never let them make you cruel. He turned back to her, his expression pained. And what of your dreams? You came west for something better than a remote cabin with a man who can barely stand civilization. I came west for a new beginning, she corrected him, for open skies and the freedom to build something meaningful. If I find those things in Whitewater Springs or Virginia City, that would be one path. If I find them here with you, that would be another. Garrett ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling. You deserve certainty, not an experiment. Hannah rose and moved toward him, stopping just beyond arm's reach. Life offers no certainties, Garrett. My father was certain of his position in Virginia City, yet here I stand, orphaned in the wilderness. All we can do is recognize when something feels right and have the courage to explore it. And this, he gestured between them, feels right to you. Yes, she said simply. Does it not to you? The vulnerability in her question seemed to pierce whatever barrier he'd erected. His expression softened, and for the first time since she'd known him, Garrett looked truly young, not the hardened frontiersman, but a man of 25 facing an unexpected fork in his solitary path. It terrifies me how right it feels, he admitted quietly. I came to this wilderness because I believed I wasn't fit for normal life anymore, that I'd seen and done too much to deserve happiness. Hannah took another step closer. And now I find myself wondering if isolation is healing me or just hiding me from what I fear. He looked down at her, a new resolve forming in his eyes. I can't promise I'll be good at this, Hannah. Courting, I mean, I've never properly done it. Hope bloomed in her chest. Are you agreeing to try? I'm agreeing that you should go to Whitewater Springs, secure lodging, and inquire about teaching positions, he said carefully. And I'm agreeing that I'll come to town regularly. We can spend time together. See if whatever this is between us has legs to stand on. A proper frontier courtship, she said, smiling despite the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. Proper as I know how to make it, he agreed. Then, with evident trepidation, he reached for her hand. When she gave it freely, he held it between both of his own. I can't offer much, Hannah, just a cabin, hard work, and a man who's trying to remember how to live rather than merely survive. Hannah curled her fingers around his. That sounds remarkably like what I'm offering too. For the first time since she'd met him, Garrett Nielsen smiled fully, a transformation so striking it momentarily took her breath away. Then perhaps, he said softly, we're not so ill-matched after all. Neither could have guessed how severely that tentative hope would be tested in the days to come. 3 days later, Garrett rode into Whitewater Springs with Hannah beside him on Hector the mule. The settlement had grown considerably since his last visit months ago. New buildings lined the single main street, and the sounds of construction echoed from the north end of town where a proper schoolhouse was taking shape. Hannah took it all in with evident excitement. It's larger than I expected. Silver Strike last spring brought new folks, Garrett explained. Town's been growing ever since. They dismounted in front of the mercantile, which doubled as a post office and general gathering place. Garrett helped Hannah down with careful hands at her waist, conscious of the sidelong glances they received from passers-by. A young, attractive woman was always a notable arrival in frontier settlements, where men outnumbered women 5-1. Mr. Nielsen didn't expect to see you until spring thaw, called Levi Monroe, the store's proprietor, as they entered. His eyes widened appreciatively at the sight of Hannah, and with company, no less. Mr. Monroe, Garrett nodded. This is Miss Hannah Pierce. She's looking for lodging in town and inquiring about teaching positions. Hannah stepped forward with a gracious smile. A pleasure to meet you, Mr. Monroe. I understand the town is building a schoolhouse. Monroe's bushy eyebrows rose. Indeed we are, Miss Pierce. Been seeking a schoolteacher these 3 months with no success. Most educated folk prefer more established settlements. He studied her with new interest. You have teaching experience. My father was Professor Arthur Pierce of Wilmington College, she replied. I assisted in his classrooms for several years and have a certificate from the Philadelphia Ladies' Seminary. Monroe's expression brightened considerably. Well now, that's providential timing. The town council meets tonight. I'm sure they'd be interested in speaking with you. As they discussed details, Garrett observed their interaction with mixed emotions. Hannah fit naturally into this conversation, her poise and intelligence evident. She belonged in civilization, among people who could appreciate her qualities, not isolated in a remote cabin with a man who sometimes went weeks without speaking to another soul. Yet the thought of her remaining here, potentially meeting other eligible men, sent an unexpected pang through him. Mr. Nielsen, Monroe's voice broke through his thoughts. I asked if you'd be staying in town overnight. Garrett cleared his throat, just long enough to help Miss Pierce get settled. I've got animals to tend to back home. Hannah's eyes met his briefly, a flicker of disappointment visible before she masked it. Well, as for lodging, Monroe continued, my sister-in-law runs a boarding house for respectable ladies just down the street. It's quite full with the seamstresses working on contract for the mining company, but she keeps a room for visitors. I'm sure she'd be pleased to have someone of Miss Pierce's quality. Arrangements were quickly made. By afternoon, Hannah was installed in a small but neat room at Mrs. Callahan's boarding house, and Garrett found himself reluctantly preparing to depart. They stood in the relative privacy of the boarding house's front porch, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the muddy street. Will you truly return in a week? Hannah asked, her voice carefully controlled. I said I would, Garrett replied. He hesitated, then added, I'll bring some of your remaining things from the cabin. Thank you, she fidgeted with her gloves. Garrett, I. Miss Pierce, Mrs. Callahan called from inside. The mercantile boy has brought up your trunk. Hannah sighed, I should go. Impulsively, Garrett took her hand and pressed it briefly. 1 week, he promised. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he turned and strode toward where Bishop waited, feeling her eyes on his back the entire way. As he rode out of town, the comfortable silence of the trail should have been welcome after the noise and bustle of the settlement. Instead, it felt strangely hollow. He told himself this separation was for the best. Hannah would see what life in town could offer. She'd meet people who could converse on books and ideas, not just hunting and weather. If their tentative understanding survived that reality, perhaps there might be something worth pursuing between them. The attack came without warning as he rounded a bend in the trail. 2 riders emerged from the trees, guns already drawn, while a third man stepped onto the path ahead. That's far enough, Cowboy, the lead man called. Hands where we can see 'em. Garrett slowly raised his hands, assessing his options. 3 against 1, all armed and positioned strategically. Not good odds. I don't have much money if that's what you're after, he said calmly. The leader, a rough-looking man with a scar bisecting his left cheek, smiled unpleasantly. We ain't after your money, Nielsen. We're looking for information. Garrett stiffened. They knew his name. Where's the Pierce girl? The man demanded. Everything inside Garrett went cold. Don't know who you're talking about. The scarred man chuckled. Now that's interesting, seeing as how you just rode into town with a pretty blonde fitting her description. He urged his horse closer. We've been tracking her since she disappeared from that wagon. Lost the trail in the snowfall, but figured she'd turn up eventually. These then were the men who'd killed Hannah's father, who'd have killed her too, given the chance. Rage surged through Garrett, but he kept his expression neutral. Whoever you're looking for, I can't help you, he maintained. That's a shame, the leader said, signaling his companions. Guess we'll have to persuade you. What followed was brutal but efficient. Outnumbered and taken by surprise, Garrett fought well but ultimately found himself on the ground, ribs cracked and face bloodied. The outlaws hadn't killed him. They still wanted information, but they'd made their point. The leader crouched beside him. Now then, where were we? Oh yes, the Pierce girl. See, she witnessed something unfortunate involving her father. Can't have her running to the law with that story. Garrett spat blood onto the dirt. Go to hell. Already been, the man replied cheerfully. Found it quite homey. He stood, nodding to his companions. Tie him up. We'll take him somewhere more private to continue our conversation. As rough hands bound his wrists, Garrett's thoughts raced. These men would eventually get what they wanted and head straight for Hannah. He had to warn her somehow. When they hauled him onto his horse, he made his move, kicking one man in the face while simultaneously driving Bishop into a gallop. Bullets whizzed past as he crashed through the underbrush, but his knowledge of the terrain gave him a critical advantage. He rode hard until he was certain he'd lost them, then circled back toward town, ignoring the pain stabbing through his ribs with each motion. By the time he reached Whitewater Springs, dusk had fallen. He rode directly to the sheriff's office, barely staying upright as he dismounted. Sheriff Dawson, a grizzled veteran of both the war and frontier law enforcement, took one look at Garrett's condition and ushered him inside. Christ, Nielsen, what happened to you? Men looking for Hannah Pierce, Garrett managed, accepting the whiskey Dawson offered. They killed her father, now they're after her as a witness. Dawson's expression darkened. The schoolteacher lady who arrived today, Monroe, was talking her up at the saloon earlier. She needs protection, they know she's here. The sheriff nodded grimly. I'll send a deputy to the boarding house. Meanwhile, you need a doctor for those ribs. Garrett shook his head. No time, they were right behind me. All the more reason to get you patched up, Dawson insisted. Can't protect the lady if you're passing out from pain. Reluctantly, Garrett allowed himself to be escorted to the doctor's house, where his injuries were treated with brisk efficiency. 2 cracked ribs, numerous contusions, and a cut above his eye that needed stitches, painful but not life-threatening. As the doctor worked, Sheriff Dawson returned with news. Deputies with Miss Pierce now. She's mighty concerned about you. Relief flooded through Garrett. She's safe. For now, Dawson confirmed. But Nielsen, I should tell you, we've had wanted posters come through for 3 men matching the description you gave. their bad business, led by a fellow named Wesley Hardin. Former Confederate irregular turned outlaw, wanted for robbery and murder across 3 territories. Garrett closed his eyes briefly. Hannah's father had some connection to Blackwater mine shares. She overheard them mention it during the attack. Dawson whistled low. That explains it. Hardin was one of the major investors in that swindle, lost a small fortune when it collapsed. So this is revenge. Or cleaning up loose ends, Dawson said grimly. Either way, Miss Pierce won't be safe until Hardin and his boys are captured or killed. A plan began forming in Garrett's mind. How many men can you deputize? 4, maybe 5 reliable ones, Dawson replied. Why? Because I have an idea, Garrett said, sitting up despite the doctor's protests, but you're not going to like it. Hannah paced the small confines of her boarding house room, alternating between worry and frustration. After Garrett had been found beaten and half-conscious on the trail, the sheriff had placed her under what amounted to house arrest for her own protection. For 2 days, she'd been confined to these 4 walls, permitted only brief, escorted trips to the dining room downstairs. Through the window, she could see the deputy stationed on the porch, a constant reminder of the danger that had followed her to this town. The guilt was nearly overwhelming. Not only had Garrett been hurt protecting her, but now the entire town was potentially at risk because of her presence. A knock at the door startled her from these thoughts. Miss Pierce, came Mrs. Callahan's voice, there's someone here to see you. The sheriff says it's allowed. Heart leaping, Hannah rushed to open the door, expecting to find Garrett. Instead, Sheriff Dawson stood beside Mrs. Callahan, hat in hand. Miss Pierce, he greeted her solemnly. May I come in? There's a matter we need to discuss. The formality in his tone sent a chill through her. Of course, Sheriff. Is it about Mr. Nielsen? Is he worse? No, ma'am. Nielsen's healing well enough, Dawson assured her as he entered. Stubborn as a mule, that one. Doctor wanted him to rest another day at least, but he insisted on riding out this morning. Hannah frowned. Riding out? Where? Dawson cleared his throat uncomfortably. That's part of what I came to tell you. Nielsen's gone back to his cabin, says he needs to secure it before winter properly sets in. He left without saying goodbye. Hannah couldn't keep the hurt from her voice. The sheriff's expression softened slightly. He asked me to give you this. He extended a folded piece of paper, said it explains everything. With trembling fingers, Hannah unfolded the note. Garrett's handwriting was surprisingly neat, if somewhat cramped. Hannah. I've given this considerable thought. What happened on the trail proves that my connection to you puts you in greater danger. These men saw us together in town and targeted me as a result. As long as they believe we have an understanding, they'll use one of us against the other. It's best if I return to my cabin and you remain in town under the sheriff's protection. Once the situation with Hardin and his gang is resolved, we can reassess our arrangement. Until then, please know that your safety is my primary concern. Respectfully, Nielsen. The formal tone felt like a slap after the tentative closeness they'd established. Hannah read it twice, searching for some hint of the connection they'd shared, but found only practical considerations and distant politeness. He just left, she asked, looking up at the sheriff. Dawson shifted uncomfortably. Nielsen's a solitary sort, miss, always has been since he came to the territory, not one for towns or complications. I see, Hannah said quietly, though in truth she didn't see at all. The Garrett who'd tenderly cared for her, who'd agreed to a courtship despite his reservations, wouldn't simply abandon her like this, unless he'd reconsidered. Unless bringing her to town had made him realize he preferred his solitude after all. The town council still wants to meet with you about the teaching position, Dawson continued, clearly trying to change the subject. They're gathering at the hotel dining room this evening. I can escort you there if you're amenable. Hannah folded the note carefully, tucking it into her pocket. Yes, thank you. I would appreciate that. After the sheriff left, Hannah stood at the window, staring out at the snow-capped mountains in the distance. Somewhere in those wilderness slopes, Garrett Nielsen had retreated to his isolation, evidently preferring it to the complications she represented. The pain of that realization was surprisingly sharp, considering their brief acquaintance. Yet in those weeks of recovery in his cabin, she'd glimpsed something rare, a man of principle and gentleness beneath the hardened exterior, someone who understood the appeal of both civilization and wilderness. Someone who might have built a life bridging those worlds with her, a foolish fancy, apparently. Hannah squared her shoulders. She'd survived losing her father and nearly losing her life. She would survive this disappointment too. That evening, she met with the town council and accepted their offer of the teaching position. The salary was modest, but included lodging in rooms attached to the new schoolhouse, which would be completed before spring classes began. In the meantime, she would start teaching the town's children in a temporary space above the mercantile. Life would go on. She would build something meaningful here, as she'd planned. If her thoughts sometimes strayed to a remote cabin and the man who dwelled there alone, well, that was a weakness she would eventually overcome. Or so she told herself until 3 days later when the shooting started. Garrett crouched in the shadows of his barn, Winchester rifle resting across his knees as he watched the approach to his cabin. The cold numbed his fingers, but he didn't dare build a fire, not when he was counting on the element of surprise. The plan had been simple, if dangerous. Make it known around town that he'd had a falling out with Hannah, then retreat to his cabin, creating an isolated target that Hardin and his men would find irresistible. Meanwhile, Sheriff Dawson and 4 deputies would circle through the forest to position themselves for an ambush when the outlaws arrived. If all went according to plan, Hannah would be permanently freed from the threat hanging over her. If not, Garrett pushed that thought aside. Failure wasn't an option. Writing that cold, formal note had been one of the hardest things he'd ever done, knowing how it would hurt her. But it had to be convincing enough to fool anyone watching, and perhaps, he admitted to himself, to protect his own heart if things went wrong today. Movement in the trees caught his attention. A rider moving cautiously along the edge of the clearing, then another approaching from a different angle. They were being careful, which complicated matters. The sheriff and his men were positioned to the north, expecting the outlaws to approach from the main trail. Garrett held his position, waiting for all 3 men to reveal themselves before making any move. Patience had kept him alive through the war and the years since. It wouldn't fail him now. A flicker of color where there shouldn't be any drew his eye to the main trail. His blood ran cold at the sight of a blue woolen dress, Hannah, riding Hector with determined precision through the snow. Everything inside him screamed in alarm. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was supposed to be safely in town, under the deputy's watchful eye. Her presence threatened to unravel the entire plan and placed her directly in harm's way. As she approached the cabin, calling his name, Garrett made a split-second decision. Abandoning his position, he raced toward her, keeping low and using the woodpile for cover. "Hannah," he hissed as he reached her. "Get down now." Her eyes widened in surprise, but she obeyed instantly, sliding from the mule into his waiting arms. "Garrett, what's happening?" she whispered as he pulled her behind the woodpile. "Hardin and his men are here," he explained tersely. "We set a trap, but you've ridden right into it. What in God's name are you doing here?" Anger flashed in her eyes. "I came because your note was obviously a ruse. Deputy Jenkins let slip that you and the sheriff had some plan to lure the outlaws away from town. Did you think I'd just sit quietly while you risked your life for me?" A shot rang out, splintering wood inches from their heads. Garrett shoved Hannah lower, covering her body with his own as he returned fire. "Stay down," he ordered, reaching for the signal whistle around his neck. 3 sharp blasts would alert Dawson that the plan had changed. Before he could raise it to his lips, more shots erupted from the tree line, Hardin's men advancing under covering fire. One bullet grazed Garrett's arm, tearing through his coat sleeve. Hannah gasped at the sight of blood, but he shook his head. "Just a scratch. We need to reach the cabin. More ammunition inside." "There's a man at the back door," she warned. "I saw him as I approached." Garrett cursed under his breath. They were surrounded, the ambush had failed, and now Hannah was in danger because of his miscalculation. The weight of it pressed down on him like a physical burden. "I'm sorry," he said roughly. "This is my fault." Hannah gripped his arm. "No time for that now, we need a plan." Her calm in the face of danger steadied him. "Right, when I give the signal, run for the root cellar door. It's hidden under the snow by that oak stump. I'll cover you." "And then you'll follow," she insisted. "As soon as I can," he promised, though they both knew it might not be that simple. Garrett fired several shots in quick succession, providing covering fire as Hannah darted across the open ground. His heart nearly stopped when she stumbled in the deep snow, but she recovered quickly and reached the cellar doors. Once she disappeared inside, he prepared to follow, only to feel the cold press of a gun barrel against the back of his head. "That's far enough, Nielsen," came Hardin's voice. "Stand up slow, where's the girl?" Garrett raised his hands carefully. "Gone, I sent her back to town this morning." Hardin chuckled. "Now we both know that's not true. Pretty blonde in the blue dress, my man Daniels had her in his sights just now." He pressed the gun harder against Garrett's skull. "Call her out, or I put a bullet in your brain right here." "Then you'll never find her," Garrett replied steadily. "Kill me and she disappears for good, along with whatever she knows that's got you so spooked." A tense silence followed, broken only by the sound of approaching footsteps as Hardin's other men joined them. "Search the cabin," Hardin ordered. "Tear it apart if you have to." As the men moved toward the cabin, a shot rang out from the tree line, followed by another. One of Hardin's men fell, clutching his leg. The sheriff's ambush was finally springing, albeit later than planned. The momentary distraction was all Garrett needed. He drove his elbow backward into Hardin's stomach, simultaneously ducking away from the gun. The weapon discharged harmlessly into the air as both men crashed into the snow, grappling for control. Hardin was strong and fought with the desperate energy of a man facing the gallows, but Garrett had youth and training on his side. They rolled through the snow, trading blows until Garrett managed to pin his opponent, hands locked around Hardin's throat. "It's over," he growled. "Surrender now and maybe the judge won't hang you." Hardin's eyes bulged as he struggled for air, one hand scrabbling in the snow beside him. Too late, Garrett realized he was reaching for a hidden knife. Fire exploded along his side as the blade found its mark between his ribs. The pain nearly caused him to lose his grip, but Garrett held on, tightening his fingers until Hardin's struggles weakened and finally ceased. Only then did he roll away, pressing his hand against the bleeding wound in his side. Gunfire continued to echo around the clearing as the sheriff's men engaged the remaining outlaws. Garrett tried to stand but found his legs wouldn't cooperate. The knife must have struck something vital. Darkness crowded the edges of his vision as he collapsed back into the snow. His last conscious thought was of Hannah, safely hidden in the root cellar. At least he'd kept his promise to protect her, even if it cost him everything. Hannah huddled in the cramped root cellar, listening to the sounds of gunfire above. Each shot made her flinch, wondering if it had found Garrett. He'd promised to follow her, yet minutes had passed with no sign of him. The cellar doors suddenly flew open, flooding the small space with light. Hannah pressed herself against the far wall, clutching a rusted garden tool as a makeshift weapon, only to drop it in relief when Sheriff Dawson's familiar face appeared. "Miss Pierce, thank the Lord," he exclaimed. "Are you hurt?" "No, I'm fine," she assured him, accepting his hand to climb out. "Where's Garrett?" Dawson's expression grew solemn. "Doc's with him now. He took a knife wound fighting Hardin." Hannah's world narrowed to a single point of terror. "How bad?" "Bad enough," Dawson admitted, "but Nielsen's tough. Doc says he's got a fighting chance if infection doesn't set in." They'd moved Garrett into the cabin, laying him on his own bed. The doctor, a grim-faced man named Hollister who'd ridden out with the sheriff's party, worked methodically to clean and stitch the wound. Hannah rushed to Garrett's side, heart clenching at his pallor. "He's lost a good amount of blood," Dr. Hollister explained without looking up from his work. "Blade missed his lung by less than an inch. Nicked an artery, which is why he bled so heavily, but I've got that under control now." Hannah took Garrett's limp hand in hers. Will he recover?" "If we prevent infection and keep him still long enough to heal, yes." The doctor tied off his final stitch and straightened. "But he shouldn't be moved for at least a week, preferably 2. "I'll stay with him," Hannah said immediately. Sheriff Dawson cleared his throat. "Miss Pierce, that wouldn't be proper." "Proper," she repeated, a edge entering her voice. "This man nearly died protecting me. I won't leave him alone now." "I could send a nurse from town," the doctor offered. Hannah shook her head firmly. "I nursed my father through typhoid fever. I know what to do." "And she hesitated, then continued with quiet determination. "I care for him, deeply." Something in her tone must have convinced them, for Dawson and the doctor exchanged glances before nodding reluctantly. "I'll leave medicines and instructions," Dr. Hollister said. and return in 3 days to check his progress. Thank you, Hannah said, already settling into the chair beside the bed. After the doctor had explained the care regimen and the sheriff had assured her that all 3 outlaws were either dead or captured, the men prepared to depart. Dawson paused at the door. Miss Pierce, I should tell you Nielsen was mighty upset when we realized you'd left town. Said some things about stubborn, headstrong women that wouldn't be polite to repeat. A smile cracked his weathered face, but the way he said it. Well, it seemed to me there was more worry than anger behind the words. Hannah returned his smile weakly. Thank you, Sheriff. Once alone with Garrett, she leaned forward to brush a strand of hair from his forehead. You are not allowed to die, she whispered fiercely. Do you understand me, Garrett Nielsen? Not when we've only just found each other. For 3 days and nights, Hannah barely left his side. She bathed his fever-hot skin with cool cloths, changed his bandages, and spooned broth between his lips when he was conscious enough to swallow. She read aloud from the books on his small shelf, mostly histories and a worn Bible, her voice filling the cabin during the long hours when he lay still as death. On the 4th morning, she woke from a brief doze in the bedside chair to find Garrett watching her, his green eyes clear for the first time since the attack. You're here, he said hoarsely. Hannah reached for the water cup, helping him drink before responding. Of course I'm here, where else would I be? Safe in town, he replied, a hint of his usual stubbornness returning. Not risking your reputation looking after a half-dead cowboy. My reputation, Hannah laughed softly. I rather think that's the least of our concerns right now, her expression sobered. You nearly died, Garrett. Not for lack of trying on Hardin's part, he agreed weakly. Why didn't you tell me about your plan? She demanded, the worry of the past days finally finding voice as anger. Did you think I'd object? Or that I couldn't keep the secret? Garrett closed his eyes briefly. I thought I was protecting you, keeping you apart from the danger. And how did that work out? She challenged. I nearly got us both killed by riding into your trap. I'm aware, he said dryly, though to be fair, the plan was going poorly even before you arrived. Despite herself, Hannah felt a smile tugging at her lips. Even badly wounded, Garrett maintained his wry perspective. It was one of the many things she'd come to love about him. The realization struck her with sudden clarity. Love, not just affection or attraction, but love deep and certain despite their brief acquaintance. Perhaps because frontier life stripped away pretense and revealed true character more quickly than drawing rooms and dance cards ever could. Garrett, she began hesitantly, that note you sent. Wasn't what I wanted to say, he finished for her. Sheriff Dawson insisted it had to be convincing, in case Hardin had someone watching in town. Relief flooded through her. So you didn't mean those things about reconsidering our arrangement? Garrett reached for her hand, his grip weak but determined. The only thing I've reconsidered is whether I deserve someone like you. Nearly dying has a way of clarifying one's thinking. And what conclusion did you reach? She asked, heart pounding. That I don't deserve you, he said simply, but if you're fool enough to want me anyway, I'm not noble enough to refuse. Hannah laughed, tears springing to her eyes. That may be the least romantic declaration I've ever heard. A smile tugged at his lips. I warned you I wasn't good at courting. Perhaps you could try again, she suggested, leaning closer. Now that we've established I'm staying regardless of your noble attempts to drive me away. Garrett's expression softened, vulnerability showing through his usual reserve. Hannah Pierce, I've spent 4 years believing the frontier was no place for love, that a man could only count on himself out here. You've proven me wrong at every turn. He squeezed her hand. I don't know what future we might build, but I know I want to face it with you beside me. Better, she whispered, bending to press a gentle kiss to his forehead. Much better. Recovery came slowly but steadily after that. By the time the first heavy snows of winter truly closed the mountain passes, Garrett was able to move around the cabin with the aid of a walking stick. Dr. Hollister pronounced him lucky to be alive but healing well. As December arrived, bringing with it the Christmas season, Hannah faced a decision. The school term would begin in January, requiring her presence in town. Yet the thought of leaving Garrett alone in his remote cabin, still recovering from his wounds, troubled her deeply. They sat before the fire on a particularly cold evening, a comfortable silence between them as Hannah mended one of Garrett's shirts and he whittled a small wooden figure, a hobby he'd taken up during convalescence. "I've been thinking," he said suddenly, setting aside his work, "about the school term." Hannah looked up, surprised he'd broached the subject first. "Oh. You should take the position," he continued. "You'd be wasted out here with only me and the wildlife for company." She studied his face, searching for signs this was another misguided attempt at noble sacrifice. Finding none, she asked carefully, "And what about you?" Garrett took a deep breath. "I thought perhaps I might find lodging in town for the winter. The mercantile mentioned needing help with inventory and deliveries, work I could manage even while finishing my recovery." Joy bloomed in Hannah's chest. "You'd consider living in town, even temporarily." "I would consider many things I once thought impossible," he replied with a small smile, "for the right reasons." Hannah set aside her mending and moved to sit beside him on the bench. "And what might those reasons be?" In answer, Garrett reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, offering it on his open palm, a wooden ring, intricately carved with a pattern of intertwining vines. "I'm not a wealthy man," he said quietly, "can't offer you gold or silver. But I carved this from the oak that grows beside this cabin, the tree that sheltered you when you needed refuge. Seemed fitting somehow." Hannah stared at the ring, her heart too full for words. "I know it soon," Garrett continued, uncertainty creeping into his voice. "We've known each other barely 2 months, but out here, life doesn't always give you the luxury of time. What I do know is that I love you, Hannah Pierce. Enough to face my demons, enough to rejoin the world I'd abandoned." Tears spilled down Hannah's cheeks as she took the wooden ring, turning it in her fingers to admire the craftsmanship. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Like its intended wearer," Garrett said softly, "if you'll have it and me." Hannah met his gaze, seeing all the love and hope and trepidation he couldn't fully express in words. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it." When he kissed her, it felt like coming home, not to a place but to a person, to the understanding that home could exist wherever they built it together. Spring came late to the Montana Territory in 1876, but when it arrived, it transformed the landscape with explosive beauty. Wildflowers carpeted meadows still wet with melting snow, and birdsong filled the air from dawn until dusk. On a perfect May morning, Hannah Pierce stood on the porch of the newly completed schoolhouse, watching children play in the yard before the day's lessons began. 4 months of teaching had confirmed what she'd always suspected, that education was her calling, her way of building something meaningful on the frontier. Inside, 27 students of various ages waited for their lessons, a number that had grown steadily as word spread of the Philadelphia-educated schoolteacher in Whitewater Springs. The town itself had continued to prosper, with new buildings rising along the main street and more families arriving each month. "Miss Pierce," called a small voice. 6-year-old Emma Miller tugged at her skirt. "Mr. Nielsen is coming up the street with Mr. Monroe." Hannah smiled, thanking the child before ringing the bell to call her students inside. As they filed past, she watched Garrett approaching with the mercantile owner, deep in conversation. The months in town had changed him subtly. His hair was trimmed shorter, his clothes a bit less rustic, but his straight-backed carriage and watchful eyes remained the same. What had changed most profoundly was the ease with which he now moved through town, nodding greetings to passers-by and occasionally even joining conversations at the hotel dining room. The solitary frontiersman was still evident in his quiet ways, but no longer did he seem a man apart from society. As the men reached the schoolhouse, Mr. Monroe tipped his hat to Hannah. "Good morning, Miss Pierce. Just discussing final arrangements with your intended here. Everything's set for Saturday." Hannah felt her cheeks warm. "Thank you, Mr. Monroe. Your wife has been tremendously helpful with the preparations." "Happy to do it," the merchant replied cheerfully. "Town's first proper wedding deserves celebrating. Speaking of which, I'd best get back and help the missus with those cake layers she's fretting over." With another tip of his hat, he continued down the street. Garrett climbed the steps to join Hannah on the porch, a smile lighting his features as he took in the sight of her. The wooden ring he'd carved still adorned her finger, though it would soon be joined by a simple gold band. "How are you this morning?" he asked, taking her hand. "Nervous," she admitted, "about Saturday, not today's lessons." His thumb traced circles on her palm, having second thoughts. About marrying you, never, she squeezed his hand. Just about having the entire town watching while I do it. Garrett chuckled. We could still elope. Bishop could have us in the next county by nightfall. And disappoint Mrs. Monroe after she's baked 3 separate cake layers? I think not. Hannah glanced through the schoolhouse window where her students were settling at their desks. I should go in. Garrett nodded but held her hand a moment longer. I'll see you this evening. Final fitting for your dress at Mrs. Callahan's, isn't it? Yes, will you be at the cabin? Since their engagement, they'd maintained the proprieties, Hannah staying at the boarding house while Garrett divided his time between town lodgings and his wilderness cabin, which he refused to abandon entirely despite his adaptation to town life. For a few hours, he confirmed, need to check that the roof repairs are holding after the spring rains. His expression softened. 3 more days and you won't have to ask where I'll be anymore. The promise in those words warmed her through. 3 more days, she echoed. As he descended the steps, Hannah called after him, Garrett, are you happy with how everything's turned out? He turned back, considering her question with characteristic thoughtfulness. I spent 4 years believing I needed solitude to heal from the war, he said finally. Turns out what I really needed was you. With that simple truth hanging in the spring air between them, he continued down the street toward the livery where Bishop waited. Hannah watched him go, marveling at how thoroughly life could change in the span of 6 months. When she'd awakened injured and feverish in a stranger's cabin last November, she could never have imagined that by May, she'd be preparing to marry that stranger, teaching in a frontier town, and building a life that somehow bridged both wilderness and civilization. Turning to enter the schoolhouse, Hannah Pierce reflected that perhaps this was the true promise of the frontier, not just land and opportunity, but the chance to rewrite one's story entirely. To find healing and purpose and love in the most unexpected of places. To be rescued from wilderness, both literal and figurative, and in turn, become someone else's salvation. The cowboy who had once believed the frontier was no place for love had made her a promise that cold November day, though neither of them had recognized it at the time. That she wouldn't die alone in the wilderness. What had begun as a simple act of human decency had transformed into something far more profound, a promise of shared tomorrows, of a home built between 2 worlds, of a love strong enough to tame the wild frontier within them both. As the school bell rang one final time, calling stragglers to their lessons, Hannah smiled at the thought of the wooden ring on her finger and the future it represented. Some promises, it seemed, were destined to grow far beyond their original intentions, becoming, in the process, the foundations upon which lives were built.